Picture the life everyone imagines when they think about ancient Egyptian royalty. Flowing linen robes, gold jewelry catching the desert light, living inside a palace complex that most Egyptians would never set foot in. Eating food prepared by the finest cooks in the kingdom, having servants attend to your every need. Now, let me tell you what that life actually cost. You're a concubine in ancient Egypt, not a wife, not a queen, not a servant exactly. You exist in a specific, carefully defined space between those categories. You're desired enough to be kept in the royal harem. You're not important enough to have any real security. And the difference between those two things is what makes your life genuinely terrible in ways that all the gold jewelry in the world cannot fix. Nobody asked if you wanted this. Women became Egyptian concubines through several pathways, and none of them involved choice. Some were daughters of foreign rulers and noblemen, given as political gifts to seal alliances and treaties. Your father was a Nubian chieftain or a Syrian noble, and when he negotiated with Pharaoh, you were part of the negotiation. A breathing, diplomatic offering. You arrived in Egypt speaking a different language, practicing different customs, worshipping different gods, and you were expected to become part of the royal harem whether you wanted to or not. Some were Egyptian women from noble families who were presented to Pharaoh as a way of their families to gain favor and access to royal power. Your father saw an opportunity, and you were the opportunity. Your feelings about this arrangement were not part of the calculation. Some were captured in military campaigns. Egypt fought constantly, expanding and defending its borders across centuries. Women taken in these campaigns could end up in royal or noble harems as a matter of course. You might have been a princess in your own kingdom 3 months ago. Now you're property in someone else's. Some were purchased. Egypt had an active slave trade, and attractive young women could be acquired specifically for harems by wealthy men and by Pharaoh himself. Whatever path brought you here, you arrived in the royal harem and the doors closed behind you. The harem wasn't just a living arrangement, it was an institution with its own hierarchy, its own politics, its own economy, and its own very specific and very limited options for the women inside it. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, it wasn't a choice, but at least the conditions were good, right? At least you were comfortable. Well, yes and no, because comfort and security are very different things, and in the Egyptian harem, you might have one without any of the other. The Egyptian royal harem, called the Kenneret, was a large, complex institution, not just a collection of women kept for the pharaoh's pleasure, though it was certainly that. It was also an economic and administrative unit with workshops, estates, and its own staff of administrators, guards, and servants. Women in the harem were housed, fed, and clothed. They had access to music, crafts, and entertainment. They were not living in squalor or suffering obvious physical deprivation in most cases, but they were confined. The harem was a closed world. Women inside it didn't move freely through Egyptian society. They didn't go to markets or visit temples or maintain normal social lives. Their world was the harem complex and whatever portion of the palace they were permitted to access. They were watched constantly. Male guards called the eyes and ears of Pharaoh monitored the harem. Access to women inside was controlled rigidly. The fear of any sexual contact between harem women and men outside the royal family was taken extremely seriously because it threatened the certainty of royal paternity. If you were a concubine, Pharaoh could visit you when he wished. You couldn't seek him out. You couldn't request an audience. You waited. You existed in a state of permanent availability and permanent uncertainty. Your status depended entirely on Pharaoh's interest in you, and whether that interest produced something valuable to him, specifically a son. The royal harem held the principal wife, the great royal wife, and a varying number of secondary wives and concubines. The hierarchy among these women was rigid and consequential. The great royal wife held the highest status, and her sons had the strongest claim to succession. Secondary wives held intermediate positions depending on their own background and how many sons they'd produced. Concubines were at the bottom of this hierarchy with the least security and the most to gain or lose from a single pregnancy. If you produced a son, everything changed. A son gave you status, security, resources, and a future. Your son might not be the heir, but he was a prince, and you were the mother of a prince, with a position of real significance in Egyptian society. If you didn't produce a son, or if you didn't produce children at all, you remained at the bottom of the harem hierarchy indefinitely. You'd grow older in the harem, less frequently visited by Pharaoh as new women arrived and captured his attention, slowly fading into the background of an institution that had no use for women who weren't producing children. The pressure to become pregnant was immense, and the circumstances under which you might become pregnant gave you no control whatsoever. Pharaoh came when he wished. He didn't come when he didn't wish. Whether you conceived was a matter of biology and chance, and his interest in you, none of which you could influence in any meaningful way. Egyptian medical knowledge included fertility treatments, prayers to Hathor and Toret, magical rituals designed to encourage conception. Women in the harem used all of these because they understood that conception was survival, and the failure to conceive was a slow slide into irrelevance. And then there were the other women watching you, calculating your status relative to their own, ready to advance if you declined. The harem held many women, and each of them had the same fundamental interests as you: to attract the pharaoh's attention, to conceive a son, to secure their position and their future. This created an environment of constant political maneuvering and occasional outright danger. Historical records from ancient Egypt document harem conspiracies. The most famous is the harem conspiracy against Ramesses III around 1155 BCE, documented in what are called the judicial papyri. A secondary wife named Tai organized a conspiracy involving multiple harem women and outside co-conspirators to assassinate Pharaoh and place her son on the throne. The conspiracy was discovered. The trials that followed documented an extensive network of people who had been recruited, messages that had been passed out of the harem through servants, magical rituals performed to weaken the pharaoh. The women involved were tried, and most were executed or forced to commit suicide. This tells you several things about life in the harem. It tells you that women inside had enough time, intelligence, and motivation to organize complex conspiracies. It tells you that the stakes were high enough that some women were willing to risk death to change their situation or advance their sons. And it tells you that the harem, despite all its surveillance and control, was a place of genuine political activity where women exercised what agency they could in circumstances that gave them very little. But it also tells you how dangerous the harem could be. You weren't just competing with other women for Pharaoh's favor, you were potentially living alongside women desperate enough to commit murder. And if you were seen as a threat to someone else's plans or as a potential witness to a conspiracy, your safety was not guaranteed. The gold jewelry and fine linen couldn't protect you from the women sleeping 20 feet away. If you were lucky enough to still be in the royal harem when Pharaoh died, your situation changed immediately and dramatically. You were now a widow of the previous pharaoh. This gave you a specific status, but it was a complicated one. You were connected to the old reign in a way that could make you either valuable or threatening to the new one. If your son had become pharaoh, your situation improved dramatically. You became a queen mother with real power and influence. Egyptian history records several queen mothers who exercised significant political authority. This was the best possible outcome, the reward for having produced the right son at the right time. If your son had not become pharaoh, or if you had no sons, you entered a kind of institutional limbo. You were part of the household of the previous pharaoh. You couldn't remarry because you had been connected to royalty, and marriage to anyone outside the royal family was inappropriate. You couldn't just return to ordinary Egyptian life. Some former harem women spent the rest of their lives in a kind of ceremonial retirement, maintained by the state in modest conditions, connected to a man who was dead, and a reign that was over, with no real role or purpose in the new order. You'd given your youth to the harem. You'd competed and maneuvered and hoped and waited, and at the end of it, if fortune hadn't favored you with the right son at the right moment, you ended your days in comfortable irrelevance. The gold had always belonged to Pharaoh. You'd just been allowed to wear it for a while. Being an Egyptian concubine meant living inside one of the ancient world's most controlled and politically charged institutions. It meant giving up freedom of movement, freedom of choice, and any life outside the harem's walls. It meant competing constantly, maneuvering carefully, and building your entire future on the biological lottery of whether you conceived and whether that conception produced a son. It meant living surrounded by women who had the same desperate stakes as you and who might, under sufficient pressure, become genuinely dangerous. It meant your security depended entirely on a man's interests in you, and that interest was always temporary, always subject to the arrival of someone younger and newer, always beyond your control. The jewelry was real, the palaces were real, the food was real. But so was the confinement, so was the competition, so was the profound and total absence of any choice about your own life. You were desired enough to be kept, you were never important enough to be free. That was life as an Egyptian concubine. Would you have survived as an Egyptian concubine in ancient Egypt?